Noticeable muscle growth takes a long time to achieve. Even if we are training effectively, it occurs so slowly that it is hard to know if you are even building any muscle at all in the short term. If we compare muscularity over a short-term time frame, let's say around 1 month apart, we are looking at such a tiny difference in muscle size that it probably isn't noticeable on our physique. This can be discouraging to some extent because we don't really see the results of our hard work until years later. So the question is, how do we really know if we are building muscle or not without having to wait multiple years to see results? In this video, we will explore what tools trainees can use to assess muscle growth throughout their training career. The first discussion we need to have is about how long does muscle growth actually take. Traditionally, it was thought that neural strength adaptations occur in a matter of days and weeks, but actual muscle growth only starts occurring after around 6 to 8 weeks or so of consistent training. However, this was probably an assumption that was presented since we didn't have tools that were sensitive enough to measure muscle growth over very short timeframes. However, with modern technology, it has been established that this probably isn't true. This idea was explored in this study, which measured untrained subjects' muscle and strength every week over an 8-week training program. And as we can see, both muscle and strength slowly and consistently increased across the 8 weeks. So it seems that muscle growth does in fact start to occur essentially immediately after starting a consistent weight training program. However, the real question is, how long does it take to see large visual improvements in muscle on our physique? And even more of a long-term question is, how long will it take for us to build enough muscle to be happy with our physique? Well, these are very difficult questions to answer because it will be highly variable from person to person based on their training protocols, consistency, diet, genetics, and their training goals. Based on my own personal experience and viewing the journey of other trainees, I would say that drug-free lifters usually need at least 10 years of consistent training to get to a level of muscularity that they are content with. For some, it may be achieved faster, and for others, it may take longer. So, because it can take up to or even more than a decade to achieve substantial muscle growth, it can become very difficult to assess if you are making progress in the short term. So the question now becomes, how do we know that we are making progress on a week-to-week or month-to-month basis? Well, there are some direct methods we can use to assess muscle growth, which can be quite accurate. There are 3 primary methods that we can use to assess muscle growth over time, which we will now discuss. The first and most accessible method is visual appearance. This refers to taking photos or videos of your physique and comparing them to previous points in time. This is the most direct measure of physique changes that we have because we are literally assessing how we look versus how we used to look. While it is the most direct measure of physique assessment, it isn't very easy to assess changes. This is because physique comparisons are ultimately subjective and can be influenced by posing, angles, lighting, fullness, and much more. Furthermore, while long-term muscle growth will likely be noticeably visible on your physique, it will almost be impossible to notice differences in the short term. Another measure of body composition we have is skin folds. This is when calipers are used to pinch rolls of skin, and based on the skin thickness at various sites of the body, your body fat percentage is approximated. This is really an estimate of body fat, but it can also be used to estimate lean mass too. However, once again, short-term changes in muscle mass are hardly going to be noticeable using this method. And the last form of body composition measurement is through various technologies. The most common forms are bioelectrical impedance and DEXA scans. Depending on the exact technology and the specific manufacturer, these can be more or less accurate. However, the good thing is that these measures are usually quite consistent, so they can fairly accurately assess changes in body composition, even small changes. While they can accurately detect small gains in muscle, they will unfortunately be subject to variation based on a number of different factors which we will cover in the next section. So the reality is that direct measures of muscle growth still aren't really reliable enough to assess short-term changes in muscle growth. They may be useful to assess long-term muscle growth over months and years, but probably aren't really useful for short-term assessment. Even if we had technology that was extremely accurate, it still probably wouldn't be useful to measure muscle growth over a short-term time frame. This is because muscle growth is just such a slow process that we aren't going to see significant changes in the short term anyway. Furthermore, these direct measurements are subject to fluctuations based on a number of different factors. This will further result in unreliable results, making them even less useful to assess muscle growth. There are 3 primary factors which we will now discuss. The first is our current body weight. When comparing muscle mass between 2 different points in time, we would ideally do this at a similar body weight. This would make it clearer to see true changes in muscle mass. This is the case especially when looking at visual measures of muscle growth. If you compare 2 visuals of yourself at a similar body weight, you will more accurately be able to detect physique changes. However, if your body weight is quite different between 2 points in time, most of the visual changes will be due to an increase or decrease in body fat rather than muscle mass. Furthermore, having more or less body fat will also influence technical measures of body composition too. This research review suggested that fat tissue itself has some component of lean mass to it. So when we use technology like DEXA scans, it may under or overestimate muscle mass based on body fat changes. This once again supports the idea that measuring muscle growth at different body weights may conflate the accuracy of changes in muscle mass. Another conflating factor is the amount of glycogen that is currently stored in our muscles. This will be influenced by our carbohydrate intake in the days prior to our assessment of muscle mass. Once again, this will influence both visual assessments and other estimates of body composition too. In fact, glycogen manipulation is a strategy that physique athletes use to enhance their visual appearance on show day. Generally, these athletes will increase carbohydrate intake in the few days prior to their show to increase the appearance of muscle fullness and vascularity. And this isn't just an anecdotally observed phenomenon, it has been shown to influence changes in muscle mass and body fat via technology too. For example, this study found that 3 days of a high carbohydrate diet before a DEXA scan caused an almost 1 kilo increase in lean mass and about a 0.4% reduction in body fat. And the other variable which can influence our measurement of body composition is our hydration status and water intake. This is very similar to the glycogen discussion earlier, where water intake tends to increase measures of lean mass and decrease body fat. For example, this study found that just 500 milliliters of water ingestion prior to a DEXA scan resulted in a 0.6 kilogram increase in lean mass and a very small reduction in body fat percentage. These variables together can result in substantial fluctuations in body composition. Because significant muscle growth takes such a long time to achieve, small changes in any of these variables may provide inaccurate or even completely cover up changes in muscle growth over a short period of time. So the reality is that even the most accurate assessments of muscle growth aren't going to be all that precise to assess short-term changes in muscle growth. This isn't very useful because we want to know if the training that we are doing right now is effective or not. So how can we know if we are effectively building muscle without having to wait 6 to 12 months to get the results of a scan? Well, the reality is that there is no real way to be completely sure that you are building muscle mass. This is an inherent part of the muscle building process, that we can't objectively measure everything. However, there are some ways that we can get short-term feedback as to whether or not our training sessions are providing an effective training stimulus. These aren't direct measures of muscle growth, but they are certainly useful tools to guide us in the right direction. Let's now cover what they are. First is the sensation which we often call the mind-muscle connection. This is essentially the feeling of contraction and stress in the target muscle. This is an indicator we can use during a set to assess the effectiveness of a training session. The mind-muscle connection is a general indicator that your exercise selection and lifting technique are training the specific muscle you are trying to target. Not all muscles and exercises will result in a strong mind-muscle connection, but it is probably a good idea to strive to improve it over time. This may involve making small changes to your technique or selecting different exercises which provide a better perceived stimulus. Second, we have the muscle pump. This is the feeling of swelling and fullness we get in the muscle after a set. If we feel somewhat of a pump in the target muscle after a set, then this is probably a good indicator that the muscle was trained to some extent. However, if we feel a pump in a different muscle we weren't trying to train, it suggests that we can probably tweak our training to get a better stimulus on the target muscle. Once again, we probably won't feel a strong pump after every set for every muscle, but it is a good general indicator that the muscle was stressed to some extent during the previous set. The next indicator we have is muscle soreness. This refers to the soreness we feel in the following 1 to 2 days after training a muscle. This is a general indicator that the muscle was disrupted to some extent, and therefore some form of adaptation will take place. So if we tried to train a certain muscle group and we felt somewhat sore the next day, that is probably a good sign that you hit that muscle pretty well. However, it should be noted that muscle soreness can occur after all different forms of exercise, so we are specifically talking about this in the context of normal hypertrophy training. And lastly, we have lifting performance. This refers to the load lifted and rep performance of our lifts over time. In relation to hypertrophy training, we are specifically referring to rep performance in the hypertrophy ranges. Generally, an increase in lifting performance over time is a good sign of muscle growth occurring. However, when assessing lifting performance as an indicator of hypertrophy, we need to make sure all other variables are controlled for to some extent, because they too can influence lifting performance. So lifting performance over time can only really be used to gauge muscle growth for the same lifts with the same technique. This is more of an intermediate indicator of muscle growth rather than a short-term indicator, since most lifters won't see improvements in lifting performance every single session. Rather, trainees can use this indicator as a general assessment of muscle growth over a multi-week and multi-month period of time. So essentially, trainees can use these general indicators as guides to assess the training stimulus. While they aren't direct measures of muscle growth, they are the best tools we have to make informed decisions in the short term. So while we may wait multiple months or years to directly measure muscle growth, we can use these tools in the meantime to continue making smart choices. Following these indicators will likely result in effective training and greater muscle growth over time. So to summarize this video, let's establish some practical recommendations. First, we should understand that substantial muscle growth takes a long time to achieve. We are talking about a multi-year time frame. So while we do have fairly accurate measures of assessing muscle growth directly, they aren't really going to be very useful to measure hypertrophy in the short term. This is because these measurements can be influenced by our body fat levels, hydration status, and glycogen storage. So the gains that we would see in a short-term time frame may be partially or completely masked by these variable factors. So these direct measures are probably better to be used for long-term assessments of muscle growth rather than short-term assessment. This will allow us to accumulate more total muscle tissue so that we can actually see significant changes. Furthermore, these measurements won't give us useful feedback for multiple months or even years. So this doesn't really provide us with any useful information to make our training sessions more effective in the present time. However, we do have some indirect indicators of effective training that we can use to make informed decisions. We can use the mind-muscle connection, the muscle pump, muscle soreness, and lifting performance as general gauges of effective training. This can guide our training in the short term, while direct measures can be used for long-term assessment if desired.